This is the story of Hluthg the First. There was once a troll whose name was Hluthg. Now, while many trolls have some redeeming qualities, Hluthg was able to speak coherently, and Gogog was content with his life in a hut by the roadside. Hluthg had no redeeming qualities at all. There was truly nothing to like about Hluthg. He was fat, he was ugly, he stank of pig shit and earwax and vomit. He had an insatiable greed for gold, precious stones, rich food and power. He could neither read nor write. He didn't seem to have the ability to listen. But above all, he was stupid. No troll I have ever heard about or written about seems to have been as stupid as Hluthg. He was so unintelligent, he could barely string a fucking sentence together. And yet, of any troll, Hluthg probably caused the most damage to any kingdom. Even more remarkably, one could argue that it was through no deliberate or planned action of Hluthg that it happened. Hluthg did not have the ability to think ahead, or make decisions based on what was likely to happen. In fact, he may not have had the ability to make decisions at all. No, it was the people of the kingdom that allowed, indeed compelled, Hluthg to wreak the havoc that he did. You see, this story happened in the kingdom of Northumbria many years ago. Northumbria had had a long line of terrible and short-lived kings. It started with Mad King Hrothgar, who was the son of Hluthg III. Upon his coronation, Hrothgar immediately declared war on the kingdoms to the south and west of Northumbria. The war escalated quickly, and then just 2 years into the war, Hrothgar was slain on the battlefield. Some say it was one of his thanes who did it. Hrothgar had 2 sons, Siward and Sibert. Siward was the oldest and rightly should have inherited the throne from Hrothgar, but the younger and jealous Sibert wanted the throne for himself. He stabbed his older brother while he was sleeping and took the crown. 'Twas unfortunate. Had Siward become king, Northumbria might have avoided many problems over the following 30 years. King Sibert VIII, who was not quite as mad as his father, realized that there was no point in continuing the war and called for a truce. The war ended, and the Northumbrians returned home. But King Sibert was greedy. He quadrupled the taxes on the people of Northumbria. He spent the gold he acquired on castles for himself and the lords he was friends with. This did not go unnoticed by the people of Northumbria, who quickly resented their king. Some say it is fortunate, or indeed providence, that King Sibert VIII died only 8 years after his reign began. He died of a fever, though some say it was poison. Sibert had just 1 son and 5 daughters. His son, Cynric, was 13 years old when he died. Cynric became king, though much to the frustration of the lords of Northumbria. Some lords, who had not liked his father's and grandfather's reign, believed that Northumbria needed an older, wiser king to resolve the problems that the kingdom had faced over the last decade. Other lords, those who had been the personal friends of King Sibert VIII, and who had been given great castles at the public's expense, thought that Cynric lacked the ruthlessness of his father. Cynric became king. He certainly did appear to lack the ruthlessness of his father, at least at first. But he was far more cunning than his father. Cynric did not raise the taxes, but he did not lower them either. Cynric was said to be a great speaker. When common folk came to him to ask for a reduction in taxes, he was skilled at giving seemingly good reasons for why the taxes had to be so high. To protect the kingdom from the others that bordered it. To protect the kingdom from trolls and dragons and witches. Many people believed it, though many saw through the words. Cynric kept most of the money for himself, and again rewarded the lords who were friendly to him. His father had taught him well. Cynric built no castles himself, but he made those he had stronger. Most of his wealth he hoarded. King Cynric II lasted longer than his predecessors. He reigned for 15 years. But something about age made the common folk trust him less. This is where Hluthg comes into the story. Hluthg was a well-known troll in the kingdom of Northumbria long before this. He'd been doing what all trolls do, coercing road-goers into giving him food and gold. Hluthg always had a particular liking for gold above all else. He decorated the bridges he lived under and the caves he lived in with it. Indeed, some travellers even enjoyed meeting Hluthg for the way that he decorated his dwellings. Hluthg was not known for being particularly good at being a troll. He extorted gold and pork and mutton from some travellers, but he was never particularly strong, even though he was 8 foot tall, and many of the wealthier lords could have their men-at-arms fight the troll off. Perhaps it was the wealth hoarded by King Cynric that drew Hluthg to Cynric's castle. Perhaps he was drawn by the gold in the king's vaults. But he arrived in the lower town around Cynric's castle one day, the skin of his arms a maroon red from blood and mud, and the skin of his thighs and around his eyes yellow-white with clumped fat. When the king's men saw him, they charged at the troll with lances. Hluthg flopped down on the first one, stomachs first, squashing him flat beneath his armour. The second man's lance sliced along the side of Hluthg's arm, but the cut was not deep. The troll brushed aside the lance, and then slapped the second man repeatedly and clumsily, until he was knocked unconscious. The town was busy, and the townsfolk leapt back at the sight of the troll, though not one of them tried to help the king's men, for they resented the king's men as much as the king. "I am going to kill King Cynric," Hluthg shouted. And then Hluthg just stood there, gawping around, as though he had forgotten the thing he had just said. The townsfolk didn't know what to make of this at first. They didn't like King Cynric, but they didn't like trolls either. "Good," an old farmer said. "I'll give you some meat and bread if you get my tax money back after you kill him." "I will," Hluthg said, and the old farmer took out some lamb and a loaf of bread from a leather bag at the front of his cart. He gave it to the troll, and Hluthg sat down at an oak table by the side of the street and began eating. A tanner's wife, who saw what the old farmer did, walked up to the troll. "I will give you honey and water if you get my tax money back after you kill the king," she said. "I will," Hluthg said, and he grabbed the honey and the jug of water that the tanner's wife offered him. He spread the honey over the remaining bread and gulped down the water. An innkeeper, who saw what the old farmer and the tanner's wife did, walked up to the troll. "You may stay in the largest room in my inn overnight, if you also get my tax money back after you kill the king," he said. "I will," Hluthg said, and once he had finished eating and drinking, he followed the innkeeper through the doors of his inn. One of the king's men, who had not fought the troll, saw all of this happen. He ran up the hill to the king's castle, through the main gate, and into the king's court chamber, where King Cynric was sitting at the head of a table, feasting with the reeves of the kingdom. The king's man told the king what he had seen, that the troll had entered the town, that the troll had crushed 2 of the king's men, and that 3 townsfolk had offered the troll food, drink, and a room to kill the king and get their tax money back. Since the troll was not causing a problem for the townsfolk, King Cynric decided not to risk more of his men trying to fight off the troll. The townsfolk might fight off the troll themselves, once they realized how repugnant the troll was. The king issued no decree, but Hluthg was allowed to stay in the town. That evening, news of the troll spread quickly around the town. Half of the townsfolk were repulsed by the thought of a troll staying in the town. The other half, like the old farmer, the tanner's wife, and the innkeeper, saw the opportunity that the troll presented. If the troll really did kill the king, they would all get their tax money back. So they overlooked their disgust at the troll. The next day, as the troll was shuffling through the streets of the town, looking for food, many more townsfolk came and asked that the troll return their tax money after killing the king. One man offered the Troll a pair of fine leather boots that he had made overnight specially for the Troll, for trolls have far larger feet than men and women. Another man offered the Troll a fine white ermine cloak that he had previously intended to sell to a wealthy lord. And a swordsmith offered the Troll the finest weapon he had made that year, a great sword with a ruby set into the pommel. He offered it to the Troll so that the Troll may use it as he killed the king. As the Troll shuffled around, brown sweat dripping down onto the stone of the streets, the same king's man from the day before followed him and observed him. At the end of the day, he returned to the king once again, who was again sitting in the court chamber, eating glazed meats and fruits from faraway lands with his loyal lords. Once again the king's man told the king of what he had seen, but King Cynric was still not bothered by the Troll. "Whatever the people think of the Troll now," the king said, "soon they will find him disgusting, for he is a troll, and he is so obviously disgusting." That evening, news of the Troll continued to spread, this time beyond the walls of the town, to the rest of the kingdom. Half of those who heard of Hluthg were repulsed by the thought of a Troll wandering freely through the town. The other half saw the opportunity that the Troll presented. If the Troll really did kill the king, they would all get their tax money back. So they overlooked their disgust at the Troll. The next day, many of those in the kingdom who had heard of the Troll and realized what the Troll could do for them travelled to the town around the king's castle. They each carried with them something precious or valuable to give to the Troll. Some brought food and drink, others brought silver, gold, or rubies, others brought helmets, shields, and maces. The people of the kingdom lined up to give their gifts to the Troll, as the Troll sat outside the inn, eating meat and shitting into a wooden bucket, which was promptly emptied by those now loyal to the Troll. Those in the kingdom who had remained disgusted by the Troll stayed at home. Once again, the king's man who had spied on the Troll the previous day spied on the Troll throughout this day. In the evening, he again returned to the king and told him what he saw. "I am surprised that the common folk have tolerated the Troll for this long," the king said. "But soon they will realize how disgusting he is and turn against him. Still, should he try to come within 100 yards of the castle, kill him." The next morning, thousands of common folk had filled the town and stood outside the great house that the Troll now lived in. When the Troll awoke, he stepped out of his front door, carrying the great sword he had been gifted, though none of the armor. Upon seeing the Troll, the crowd roared. They chanted, "Death to Cynric! Death to Cynric! Death to Cynric!" Hluthg gawped at them all. He may have forgotten that he had sworn to kill the king, but the crowd compelled him onward. Hluthg plodded forward, up the street, towards the king's castle. The crowd swarmed around him. A line of king's men stood at 100 yards away from the gates of the castle. They saw the Troll and the crowd approaching. They drew their swords, lowered their lances, and nocked their arrows. But seeing the king's men, the crowd surged forwards, ahead of the Troll. They outnumbered the king's men 1,000 to 1. They had no weapons or armor, but the king's men did not expect to have to fight them. So within moments, the crowd had pushed through the line of lances, and pushed down the king's men into the mud of the road. They stole their swords and stabbed them through the neck, or stole their shields and bashed them against the ground. A few common folk were injured, but the injuries were minor, and all of the first line of the king's men were dead. Hluthg, who was closer to the back of the crowd than the front, continued plodding forwards up the street, seemingly unaware of what the crowd was doing. The crowd and Hluthg reached the gates of the castle, where another line of the king's men stood guarding them. They had not seen what had happened to their fellow guardsmen down the street, for there was a bend in the road. They too drew their swords, lowered their lances, and nocked their arrows. Being warier of the crowd than the guards down the road, they loosed arrows and swung swords at the crowd sooner. A few of the common folk were slain, but not many. for they still outnumbered the guards 1,000 to 1. All of the guards were killed, and the common folk surged through the gates of the castle. Hluthg was at the back of the crowd. The common folk smashed through the oak doors to the king's court. King Cynric was, once again, enjoying a great feast with his lords in the shadow of his throne. Upon seeing the common folk burst through the doors, the guards who stood around the room reached for their swords. But the common folk overpowered them too quickly, and soon they were all dead too. The common folk made no accommodation for the lords who sat around the great table. They pulled the lords from their seats, stabbed them, beheaded them, then dragged their bloody bodies across the smooth wooden floor and hurled them from the window. When all but the king were dead, they grabbed the king, his face as white as ice, and pulled him up in front of his golden throne. A few minutes later, Hluthg shuffled into the room, staining every surface he touched with the grease and shit that coated his small hands. The crowd stood around the edges of the throne room, watching the troll as he lolloped towards the restrained king. With a heave and a fart, Hluthg lugged the bejewelled greatsword over his head and down on King Cynric II. Because of the angle from which Hluthg had swung the sword, it cut down through part of Cynric's head, neck, and shoulder. It did not fully behead him, but he certainly did die. The sword cut a short way into his golden crown, and when Hluthg pulled the sword away, the bloody crown was stuck to it. The former king's body slumped to the floor as the crowd cheered. Hluthg wrenched the crown from the sword and placed it on his own head. Cynric's blood dripped down Hluthg's face, turning his clotted skin an even deeper shade of maroon. The troll kicked the king's body aside and shuffled forwards to the throne. He plopped his flabby arse on the velvet seat and stared forwards mindlessly. The old farmer, who had been the first to support the troll's ambition, stepped forwards from the crowd. "Long live King Hluthg I," he proclaimed. Half the crowd cheered. The other half looked around in confusion. They had known that Hluthg was going to kill the king, although, in truth, they hadn't needed Hluthg at any point. But they didn't know that the troll was going to become king in Cynric's place. "Long live King Hluthg I," half the crowd chanted. Hluthg continued to stare forwards, mouth open, eyes half-lidded. "After a long day," Hluthg said as the midday sun shone through the windows, "I shall retire, and tomorrow I shall begin and start the important work of ruling this noble, very noble, really good kingdom." The crowd were confused for a moment. "What about all our money?" one man said. "This evening I shall begin counting, you understand, counting, I will count. I will count, because I can do that. I can count because I'm very clever, really clever. The cleverest person you've ever, very, very clever. No one is better at counting. I am the best counter, and I will count the gold. I will count the gold. There's a lot of it, which is why we have to count it. There's a lot of big gold, and underneath this castle, in the vaults of this vaults of the castle, it's big, very big, huge. You've never seen such huge gold, the biggest gold, really, and it is in the vaults, and I shall count it. I shall, because I'm clever, and tomorrow I shall distribute it back to you. 'Cause I am clever. 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 'C King Hluthg said. The common folk were quite satisfied with that, so they began to shuffle out of the throne room, though several took some of the silver plates and cutlery that lay around with them. Hluthg pulled the great oak table at which the former king and his lords had been feasting closer to the throne, and then he continued the feast that they had not finished, eating honeyed pork and beef stew with dumplings and dates from the south. The common folk went back to their business about the town and the kingdom. The tale of what had happened spread quickly to every man, woman, lord, and king in the land. Those in Northumbria who had found the troll disgusting were shocked by it, and mortified that their kingdom was now ruled by a gruesome troll, though even they recognized the advantages of no longer having Cynric on the throne. The next day, many of the remaining reeves and thanes of Northumbria travelled to the king's castle. Some travelled there planning to slay this troll and place upon the throne a man worthy of it, someone as legitimate as Cynric, but not as malicious. But others travelled for a different reason, for now that Hluthg sat on the throne, a new opportunity was presented to them. The lords arrived at the king's castle. They walked into the throne room to find the troll asleep on the throne. Dried stew stained his mouth, and date stones were scattered across the floor. King Hluthg I had not bothered to find the privy, and had instead just shat in one of the bowls that a lord had been eating from the day before. The bowl was still on the table. "The troll is asleep," Lord Osred said. "We should kill him now, before he wakes." Lord Osred's men began creeping forwards, drawing their swords. "Troll!" Lord Edric said, to wake the troll. The others looked around sharply in frustration. Hluthg snorted awake.
"Who are you?"
he said upon seeing them. "We are the lords of Northumbria, your majesty," Lord Edric said in oily tones. Lord Osred's men sheathed their swords and stepped back. They could have overpowered Hluthg easily, as he was not strong. But most trolls are indeed very strong, and they assumed this of Hluthg too.
"What do you want?"
Hluthg belched. "Well, we are here to assist you, your majesty, in the affairs of the kingdom," Lord Edric replied. Half of the lords looked at Edric with disgust. The other half played along. You see, Edric and the other lords realized what they could do. Sure, one king was dead, and now a rancid troll wore the crown of Northumbria. But the common folk had chosen this troll to be their king. If they were willing to look past the troll's foul stench and the gunk that dripped from his flabby arms, what else would they ignore? The lords of Northumbria could raise taxes yet again, and hold back the best food for themselves. The troll was too stupid to know what was going on, as long as the troll didn't try to kill them, which, if he were given all the meat and gold that he wanted, he wouldn't. They would be fine. Lord Edric was, by all accounts of him, a bit of a shit. Hluthg stared into the distance with his mouth open.
"Bring me honeyed milk and steak,"
he spat. Lord Edric ordered some of his men to do so, and to find handmaidens from the town who would serve the troll. Hluthg ate, drank, and shat his way through the remainder of the day, while Lord Edric secured the castle vaults. Lord Osred, and the other lords who despised the troll, returned home, for Lord Edric was wealthy, and had many more men. Were it to come to battle, Lord Edric would win. By the end of the day, many of the common folk who had been promised gold by the troll returned to the castle, for they had been expecting to receive it that day, as the troll had said. Lord Edric ensured that they were permitted into the throne room, where Hluthg sat, with the blood-stained crown on his head, so that they could speak to him directly. "Your Majesty," one farmer said, "may we have the gold that you promised to return to us?"
"We are in the process. Great word, process. I invented the word process. We are returning the process to you. We are counting it, the gold, the process. There's a lot of it. There are mountains and mountains of gold beneath this castle, I tell you. If I weren't giving it away, I would be very, very, very wealthy. I would be the wealthiest king in the land. But I'm not keeping it. I'm not giving it away. I'm giving it back to the people who took it from you, which is you.
Hluthg said, spitting chewed meat and egg across the table. It didn't make sense, of course. The common folk were confused by what the troll was saying, but they understood generally what the troll meant. He was counting the money to give it back to them. It all seemed to make sense. But of course, no such thing was happening. Lord Edric had counted the money, sure, but he had counted it for his own books. And Hluthg, while he had promised anything at all to get himself inside the king's castle in the first place, even something as precious to him as gold, now that he was there, he rather fancied keeping the gold to himself and his new lordly friends. For a few days, common folk kept returning to the castle to ask their troll king for the gold he promised them. But every day he said something incomprehensible, or simply didn't talk about it at all. The common folk left again, sure that everything was fine. Those in the kingdom who had not elected to crown the troll king repeatedly asked those who had where their money was. They repeatedly told them that the troll was never going to give the gold back, because he was a troll, and that's what trolls do. But those who had fought for Hluthg insisted that even though they didn't have their tax money yet, it was better to have Hluthg on the throne than Cynric. Days turned to weeks, weeks turned to months, and months turned to years. Years. For years Hluthg I sat upon the throne of Northumbria. As time went on, everyone became sort of used to it. All of the kingdoms bordering Northumbria were astonished. Every day that went by, they were astonished that Hluthg still lived. In the weeks and months following Hluthg's coronation, Lord Edric seized control of the castles and keeps held by those lords who had been in the throne room when Cynric was killed. The land those lords had owned was given to many of the neighbouring lords, those who were loyal to Edric and to Hluthg. The taxes from those lands also went to those loyal lords. From the point of view of the common folk, it made no difference. They still paid taxes to someone. But now more land was owned by fewer people. Lord Edric was able to placate Hluthg with food and gold for several months. For the first month and a half, the troll never even left the throne room. But trolls are insatiably greedy. They are also often highly opinionated. Hluthg began to demand that new laws be enforced to his liking. Much like Gogog, Hluthg didn't like pretty boys. He demanded that it be outlawed for men to wear anything made of silk or velvet. They could not wear anything brightly coloured, and they were banned from wearing fragrances too. This only interfered with the lives of a few people, mostly sons of reeves and thanes. Few of the common folk were affected or even interested. Every day, those common folk who had always been disgusted by the troll told those who had fought for Hluthg that they would never get their tax money back. And still those who had fought for the troll insisted that they would, or that it didn't matter, or that they had even effectively gotten it back anyway, since they had avoided tax rises that there would have been under Cynric. Not that Cynric ever raised taxes, as far as is accounted. After a few years on the throne, Hluthg even outlawed any criticism of him, by noble or common folk alike. Those who dared to say anything against him were seized by Edric's men and hanged or burned. Traders from nearby kingdoms stopped coming to Northumbria. The money they might make stopped being worth the chance of something they said being mistaken for an insult against the troll king. Many people left Northumbria too. Northumbria was no longer a prosperous place. Taxes were so high and wealth concentrated in the hands of so few that farmers could not grow enough food to live, while selling enough of it to pay the owner of the land. So they left. Many went to Mercia and Wessex. After 8 years, Northumbria was an impoverished kingdom. The people who remained had little money and hardly enough food to live. Picts had begun raiding the northern lands of the kingdom. The troll king had done nothing about it. Hluthg had remained as indifferent to the common folk as ever, but he had demanded more and more from Lord Edric. After 8 years on the throne, Hluthg was twice as fat as at the start of his reign. He was so fat, he could no longer actually sit on the throne. Instead, he just sat on the stained floor in front of it. He ate nothing but the finest meat. He didn't even eat bread or sweet fruits anymore. Every day he demanded new clothes, expensive clothes made out of leather and ermine and velvet. He refused to wear anything that had been washed. After 8 years, even Lord Edric was fed up with the troll. I suppose he deserved it. Meeting the troll's demands was increasingly difficult and expensive, and the common folk no longer seemed interested in the troll. They had long since stopped coming to ask for their tax money back. Many of the common folk resented Hluthg as much as they had resented Cynric, and the troll's former supporters were no longer interested. 8 years to the day after Hluthg had killed King Cynric II, Lord Edric opened the doors to the throne room in the middle of the night when the troll was asleep. He took an arrow, knocked it in a bow, and aimed at the troll. He loosed it, and the arrow went straight through the troll's open mouth. Hluthg was dead instantly, but Lord Edric loosed 2 more arrows at the troll, just to be sure. The troll hardly made a sound as he died. Lord Edric took the ruby greatsword that Hluthg had been given years before, and cut off Hluthg's head. With a small knife, he cut away the stained crown that had gotten stuck to the troll's head, and then chucked the head out of a high window. Lord Edric washed the bloody crown, and the next morning the kingdom woke under the reign of King Edric I. For most, the proclamation of the new king made little difference to their lives, just as it had been with kings before the Troll King. Life in Northumbria improved during King Edric's reign. The laws that Hluthg had implemented were gradually removed. Taxes were lowered again. Traders returned to Northumbria. But King Edric only oversaw these changes because they were an advantage to himself. More trade meant more tax revenue, and more money for himself and his family. The fact that it improved life for everyone else in Northumbria was not important. Ultimately, the people of Northumbria did not learn anything. Even once the troll was dead, those who had helped the troll to become king insisted that it had been the right thing to do, even though they had never gotten what they wanted. Hluthg, in the end, got everything he wanted. Sure, he was killed by an arrow, but all trolls are killed eventually. Hluthg had 8 years of fine food and fine clothes in one of the largest castles in the land before being killed. Hluthg was the wealthiest troll to ever live, and got to inflict his will on more people than any other troll to live before or since. This whole story could have been avoided if Cynric had had the troll killed when he first entered the town, as any wise king would have done. Or it could have been avoided if the people of Northumbria had remembered that Hluthg was a troll, and you should never believe the words of a troll. So if there is anything that can be learned from this story, it is that a troll is a troll, and no matter what they say, a troll will always do what trolls do.